Let's get into it. This is what you came here for today, right? Let's have a think about kind of inequality in Indonesia and what people want done about it. So the Indonesian president in particular, but the Indonesian government has really prioritised addressing inequality. Been done on this. So if we go next slide. And that was by the World Bank back in 2014. And people tended to underestimate the level of inequality, and people tended to think that they were in the middle of the income distribution, regardless of whether they are rich or poor. So let me explain what I mean with these two stylized facts, one by one. So if we go next slide. So people tend to underestimate the level of inequality. The survey showed that on average, Indonesia So the extent to which people underestimate inequality is quite striking. So now if we go to the next slide, people were asked where in the income distribution they believe themselves to be. And it was clarified that, the income distribution, imagine it existed of 5 equal sections, so they're actually quintiles, but we didn't use the word quintile. Most people thought that they were in the middle. So the actual correlation between your actual place and your perceived place is only around 0.3, which shows that people tend to not have a very good idea where they're placed. So if we go to the next slide, what I've shown through a number of some initial kind of research, just getting it out there in the Jakarta Post, but also in the Guardian, I've shown that these misperceptions, which we've just outlined, so these two misperceptions, that people underestimate inequality. If you tend to think that the level of inequality isn't that high in Indonesia, you're not very supportive of the government doing it. In 15 minutes, or it could be done in 2 hours. Okay? It depends on your level of interest and what questions you ask. And I can testify I can do it in 15 minutes. Oh, sorry, I keep on moving around out of the camera. Sorry for those people who are tuning in. Sorry, Mum. No, sorry. Those people who are tuning in. So, I can testify it can take 15 minutes or 2 hours, because we did present it in 15 minutes at the President's office earlier this week, because that's how much they didn't have too much time, and we wanted to get through the main findings. Or we've presented it in 2 hours at Smearu as well. So, so whatever questions you have at any point in time, please just raise your hand. Okay, don't hold up. I won't go too fast through this, but if people don't ask me questions, I'll just keep on going. Great. Well, let's move on now to thinking about what these misperceptions mean, and if these misperceptions are correlated with people's views about inequality and preferences for redistribution. Necessary, or whether some social protection should be increased or reduced. These are the sorts of things which we want to know. So how do we go about testing this? It's a randomized control trial. So if we go to the next slide, I'll explain what I mean. So we did a survey of 3,700 Indonesians, and it's a nationally representative survey of Indonesians who have So the reason why we randomly allocated people was because each of these groups are identical, right? Each of these groups have similar numbers of male and female, similar numbers of people in urban areas, similar numbers of people who attended university, didn't attend university, and that's what randomization allows us to do. So we randomly allocated people into each of these groups, then we provided them with information, and then we saw how information affected people's views. And by comparing the treatment group to the control group, if there's any differences in people about inequality or their preferences for redistribution, we can attribute that to the information. And that's what a randomized control trial allows us to do. Comparing the difference between a treatment and control group and saying because of the randomization, we can be sure that it was the treatment that affected that. Any questions at this point in time? Because I know some people told me that...
In more simple way about this randomized control.
Okay, yeah, why don't I do it this way? I'm going to come over here because there's a few too many slides to flick through. So we'll just jump through. Sorry, if I just go. Yep, so if we go through here, so if we go. So what happened was there was 3,700 people who started off doing this survey. And of those 3,700 people, we flipped a coin. So it was like a lottery type system. And you got placed into either treatment group. What that means is that these groups are statistically identical to each other. So there's no difference between these groups of people. Therefore, when we look at the information, we provide them with information, then we see how that responds in terms of their views about inequality and their support for redistribution. By comparing the difference between those groups, we say there should be no difference, except for the fact that one got information, the other didn't, and therefore we can say the difference is due to the fact that one group got information and the other didn't. So that's that ability that a randomized control.
Sorry, so if you want to see their reactions,
Yep.
Are these populations representing the whole distribution of this wealth?
Good question. So if we go next slide. So this is where they are located on the income distribution. And what we can see, this is like the percent of people.
To what? No. Or you just use single random sample?
So we stratified the randomization by age and gender. So yeah, that's how come our results. And nationally representative, all the way back to where we were, sorry, so if we go, whoop. Cool, so this is what we did, and I'll explain again throughout. I just want to show you what we provided people, so if we go to the next slide, and then the next slide. So luckily, some of my slides are in Bahasa, so that's good. So this is what we showed people. So treatment A was provided with information about the level of inequality in Indonesia. B was provided. What did we think was going to happen? Right? So people had these misperceptions. We wanted to correct their misperceptions. What does economic theory predict is going to happen? Because economists like to speculate and simplify what's meant to happen in the world. So to predict and explain human behaviour. So economic theory would suggest that when we told people about the level of inequality, the United States and Western Europe. So as a result, it's very hard to know whether or not these theories kind of hold or what's more accurate. So if we go to the next slide, we contribute, because it's important to explain how we build upon this, by doing the first study like this in a middle income country. So in other words, it's also the first study like this in Indonesia. No one has done this before. That we did make up 1/3 of the world's population and almost half of the world's GDP. So the results that we show and the patterns we observe are such that we can be far more confident about how people react in general across the world, not just in Indonesia. So that's how we're going to contribute to this. And if we go to the next slide, I'm going to run through the results. No questions. Everyone wants to see the results, do they? Yes. They say, come on, you've had enough of a lead up. I've been paying attention. Now I want to know what happened. Okay, well, let's have a look. Next slide. The reality is, in Indonesia, most people are concerned about the gap between the rich and poor. Almost 80% of people say the gap between the rich and poor provide them with information. Next slide. Informing people about the level of inequality increases people's concern about the gap between the rich and poor and makes people far more pessimistic that hard work pays off. They're much more likely to say that hard work will not get you, it's difficult or impossible to get ahead through hard work. And I'll explain these charts that you're looking at. So I'll just use this one. So this is the control group. See this red bar here? So these are the people who got no information. So you can think this is what the general Indonesian public thinks at the moment. And around 46% of people think it is difficult or impossible to increase your standard of living through hard work. But when we tell people about the level of inequality, which is what these people were in treatment group A were told, they become much more likely to say that it's difficult or impossible. In fact, almost 55% of people in that group say that it's difficult or impossible to get ahead. So information makes people more pessimistic, and similarly, people become more concerned when they're provided with that information. So if we go to the next slide, we also wanted to understand people's views on why people are rich and why people are poor. So people were given a series of options. What is the number one reason why people are rich that they could select from? So they could select things like effort, or the family they're born into, or having connections, for example. And what you see is that 1/3 of people thought that effort is the reason why people are rich, and 1/3 of people thought that a lack of effort is the reason why people are poor. So there's two ways to look at this result. One way is to say the most popular reason why people think that people are rich or poor is because of their effort or lack of effort. Another way to look at this result is that more than half of people think that you're rich or poor because of factors outside your control. So, any questions? Please don't hold back with the questions. As I said, you can ask the question in Bahasa and then it will be translated for me. So, no? No questions? Okay. Sorry? Not yet. Sorry, but people are writing down their questions. Yeah. No, I see some people on their phone. Maybe they think they're texting in their questions. Is that what's going on? I don't know. Maybe. So, when we provide people with information, so if we go to the next slide, what happens is people become less likely to say people are rich, or less likely to say people are poor due to effort. So when we tell people about their position in the income distribution, they become less likely to say that effort is the reason why people are rich or the reason why people are poor. And so I'll just explain this chart. So here, when people are told that they're poor, right? So that's like people in this group here, the blue bar, they become less likely to say hard work is the reason why people are rich. Okay? So people with no information, around 33% of people are saying hard work is the reason why people are rich. When we tell people that they're poor, around 27% of people.
So who are the rich people? The big quantile?
Sorry, what do you mean?
Rich people. Who are the rich?
Yeah, so this question says why are people rich? It's not specifically saying which part of the income distribution when I ask people who are rich. And part of the reason is because of the fact that we want to keep it a bit more general to capture people's general views. Because if we say, oh, the richest say 40%, but then maybe some people think, oh, really, they're mainly middle class. It's only the richest 1%. We didn't want to end up in that sort of scenario. So if I go to the next slide, No one wants me to explain these regression tables, I don't think. Not at this time in the afternoon, will I? Well, maybe I'll pause there. I'll just leave this up here for a moment, but I'll pause there to highlight. What we've shown is what economic theory would predict seems to hold so far. When we correct these misperceptions, that results in them people becoming more concerned about inequality, right? When we're providing these bits of information. So far, it seems like economists might be right. But now things start to take a turn for the worst, right? Where economists haven't quite got their theory right. So if we go to the next slide, we asked people about how supportive they are for the government to redistribute from the rich to poor. And we ask this in a range of ways. And this is a chart here showing the share of respondents. So this is like, this is 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, 100%, right? And we ask a range of questions such as, are you supportive of urgent action by the government to reduce inequality? 95% of people say urgent action is required. We ask people if they agree if the government is responsible for closing the gap between the rich and poor. 75% of people agree. We ask people if the government has the tools to fix inequality. 75% of people agree. We ask people if the government should increase taxes on the richest 1% of people to fund public services. 80% of people agree. This is widespread support for redistribution. Most people would like to see more redistribution from the government. So remember, this is in the absence of information. I'm just talking about people here in the control group. This is the general population in Indonesia. But we told some people about the level of inequality in Indonesia, and we told people about their position in the income distribution. So the question is, how does that information affect their support? Does it make it higher? Does it make it lower? Well, when we told people about the level of inequality in Indonesia, when we told people that the richest 20% of Indonesians own 90% of the wealth, that did not increase their support for redistribution. They did not become any more supportive. When we told people that they were poorer than they thought, when we told people that they were at the bottom of the income distribution, they did not become any more supportive of redistribution. But when we told people that they were rich relative to other Indonesians, they became less supportive of redistribution. And that's what I show you on the next slide. They became much less likely to say the government's responsible for addressing inequality. Much less likely to say that taxes on high income earners are too low. And much less likely to be supportive of taxes on the richest 1% to fund public services. Right? So in other words, all the information we provided these different people, and it did not lead to any increase in support for redistribution. In fact, for richer people, when they were told they were rich, they became less supportive. So, if we go to the next slide, just before I move on to speaking about specific policies, and I'm almost finished going through the results, and then I'll discuss why we see some of these results. I just want to explain that we're talking here about maybe the role of the government in a general sense, not a specific policy. You know, like taxes or doing more, the government should be taking urgent action. This is a general conversation that we're having with people so far. So then what we do on the next slide is we switch the attention to specific policies that the government should do. So we say, what is the #1 policy the President of Indonesia should be prioritising to reduce inequality? What do they find? What do they find? Sorry? Create jobs. Yep. Almost 1/4 of people said creating jobs is what should be done. And I'm going to run through each of these one by one. So about 22% of people said fight corruption. Around 18% of people said social protection, increase in social protection is the key. Now, around 10% said increasing microfinance. Around 10% said free education. About 7% said to build infrastructure. Then what we see here is maybe 6% say raise the minimum wage. And only 3% of people said tax the rich as the #1 thing that the government should be doing to reduce inequality. But remember, this is based upon people who haven't been provided with information. So this is like what the general population in Indonesia want to be the case. So what happens when we tell people about the overall level of inequality? Which policies does it lead them to want to be prioritised even more? Well, that's what we show you on the next slide. Telling people about the level of inequality reduces their support for social protection and increases their support for creation of jobs and raising the minimum wage. Right? So if we go back a slide, sorry. Right? What's happening is that without information, this is what it looks like when people are told about the overall level of inequality. This goes up, create jobs becomes more popular, and social protection falls. So in other words, it moves like that. So if we go next slide, that's what we're showing there. So let me summarize some of these results. We show that correcting people's misperceptions, right, does not boost their support for redistribution. And it can even have a negative effect. Right? We show that it can reduce support for for social protection, telling people about the level of inequality, and also telling people that they're relatively rich. That lowers their support for redistribution and higher taxes. And while information can increase people's concern about inequality, that's as far as it translates in terms of being able to it does not go any further to lead to increased support for redistribution. So if we go to the next slide, we need to think through, why is this the case? Well, I should start off by saying that the ability of information to shift people's views about inequality as opposed to is kind of a bit of a common finding we see across other studies and in other countries, whereby it's easier to shift people's views than it is, right, to change their support for redistribution. And there's a few sort of theories as to why this might be the case. So a recent paper by this Harvard professor shows that people become more supportive of policies that promote equality of opportunities as opposed to equality of outcome. People want to be able to think that you can work hard and get ahead and do well, but create an even playing field, right? So that you get a standard of living that you deserve. This equality of opportunity is what people want, as opposed to maybe a communist system whereby we tax everyone so much and we redistribute so much, everyone has the same income. But there's this other issue as well, which is that people might not necessarily believe that increases in government revenue lead to better outcomes, right? So I'm just going to quickly, is it okay if I write on this butcher's paper? So we can think that what we've shown is that there's misperceptions and we provide people with information and that affects their views but that does not flow through to their support. So they become more concerned about inequality, more likely to say, this is not fair, the outcomes are not good, this is not great. But do not seem to have faith necessarily that the government will follow through and fix those concerns. So that's kind of an issue that needs further sort of examination in the context here of Indonesia. Further, social protection is limited in what it can do. There's been some research that's shown in Indonesia that social protection doesn't always reach the right people and doesn't reach enough people, and even when it reaches the right people, it's only a small amount of money that they receive. The other thing is that social protection doesn't get people to where they want to go. Okay? People don't aspire to receive a social protection payment. The best social protection can do is make being poorer more bearable. But people aspire for so much more. They want to be in middle class, right? And also, social protection simply creates a floor that you don't fall below. Whereas inequality is talking about trying to close this gap between the rich and poor. But if social protection, all it does is create a floor so that over time that gap just keeps growing bigger and bigger. So there's limits on what social protection can do. On the next slide, I talk about, we probably don't need to get to that yet. On the next slide, I talk about further research that I think needs to be done in this space and some of the questions that emerge. But maybe it does make sense to pause here for now and take questions, or should I show the last slide first? I think it maybe makes sense to pause now and then I can show the last slide during the questions.
Okay, so you mean they were asking you, or you just post the last?
Okay, well, just to make things easier, I'll do the last slide and then I'll take questions. So we'll do it that way.
Okay, yeah.
Cool. So if we go last slide, sorry. So we think that this leads to many more questions that need to be asked around the social contract in Indonesia. Understanding, would people be more supportive of social protection if it was more people were covered, right? is the fact that it's targeted only to a small set of the population, does that actually result in lower support for social protection? Whereas if everyone had access to an elderly pension or a child grant, would that actually lead people to be more supportive of this? We want to do further research where we're going to follow up people who participated in the 2014 survey to see how their attitudes have changed during Jokowi's time in office. And we also think that this research highlights that there are a number of things to think about how people's perceptions or views affect how they engage with the government. And so I'll use the example of social protection again, which is that if people don't realise that they are towards the bottom of the income distribution, they may be missing out on social protection programs and may not be actually trying to go sign up to the social protection programs to try and get their fair share or what they're entitled to just because they don't realise. Well, let's think about, say, paying tax, for example. You're probably very unlikely to pay tax if you don't think that giving money to the government will necessarily lead to better outcomes for more people. Right, so you could imagine how, if you let people know about how unequal Indonesia is and how the actual government plays a key role in redistributing and, to keep everyone above the poverty line, that could be one way of motivating people to be more willing to pay taxes. Or you could let people know about how money is spent in terms of the fact that 20% of the budget is being spent on education, for example, and let people know that actually when you pay your taxes, a large share of it is going towards everyone in society to benefit. So I guess I wanted to highlight that this research has led us to ask lots of interesting questions about the social contract, or the relationship between people and the government in Indonesia, and a lot more work needs to be done in this space. But we can also think more broadly about how this kind of leads to people to interact with the government in different ways, such as social protection and tax. I might pause there, so I might wrap up there, and then we can take questions, and I may revisit some of the slides as we need to.
Okay. Thank you, Chris, and give applause to Chris. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting presentation. First, because surprisingly, it's cheap RCT, because it's used currently. We usually very expensive to do RCT, but I don't know how cheap it is. You can ask Chris. And second, discussing inequality on the perspective of perception is also, I think, is something new, because yeah, usually we use other approach on that, and it's related, Chris said, in social contract and the other thing. So I think it's very interesting. So we give you opportunity to give a question to Chris. For the first step, we have 3, I think. 1, 2, and 3. Okay. Okay. Okay, please. That's it. Your name and.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Firdausi. I'm from Unpad, Respondents. I have some questions that I would like to ask. Several questions, I meant. Maybe you already explained to us some of it, but I was wondering about the priority. What actually the government needs to prioritize first in order to reduce the gap of inequality? Because you explained several options, like about using the social protection or about increasing people who become rich or whatsoever. Because like when we look at developing countries, it tend to be like pyramid, yeah? But I think in some countries where they already developed, it looks like, I'm not really sure how to explain. I think it's more like a pillow. Yeah. So there are no certain people who are so rich, but I think in developing countries like Indonesia, it's more like pyramid. So there are more people like who are poor, and then it's just 10% or 20% who are rich. So what actually is it? More because of the ideology, because you mentioned about social contract whatsoever. So do you think the priority of the government is also determined by the ideology of the politics and the country as well, or what? And also, I was wondering how on earth that building infrastructure is not seen as important to increase the inequality. Meanwhile, this is something that been prioritized by the current government. And lastly, it's about the finance literacy as well as lifestyle. How far do you think this lifestyle and finance literacy will close the inequality? Because sometimes people, even if they are born into rich people, but when they don't have this, they can become easily to be a poor people as well. And I think that's happened in Indonesia as well. I think this is it for now. Thank you.
Terima kasih Pak ya. Saya bahasa Indonesia aja Pak ya, supaya lancar. Nanti kalau saya bahasa Inggris beda apa yang saya mau dengan apa yang saya tanya. Ya, nama saya Al-Mizan, yaitu dari Kementerian Keuangan. Jadi penjelasan Chris tadi menarik sekali ya. Kalau ditanya ke masyarakat, kira-kira untuk mengurangi inequality ini yang paling pas, kelihatannya dukungan yang paling kuat itu adalah menciptakan pekerjaan, menciptakan lebih banyak pekerjaan dibandingkan dengan kegiatan bansos, pemberian bansos dan subsidi yang tahun kemarin kan sangat populer. Pertanyaan saya, kira-kira spesifik nggak itu menciptakan pekerjaan yang bagaimana yang diinginkan oleh publik itu, atau bagaimana cara pemerintah menciptakan pekerjaan yang lebih banyak itu? Dalam survei ini kira-kira pertanyaannya spesifik, lebih spesifik, atau secara umum saja? Yang penting lebih banyak lokal itu kira-kira. Ya, terima kasih ya.
Thank you, Christopher. Previously, I've attending University of New South Wales class in your Australian embassy, but it's more about the positioning of in between how far Russian, China, and United States impact to the Southeast Asia tendency, especially in economy. But what I would like to know, because I've never been into any Australian National or University of Sydney's classes, in your perspective, is it only innate by the Indonesian for its inequality, or it could be also covariant by some factors in terms of international relations impact? Thank you.
Namanya siapa?
My name is Taufan from University of Indonesia.
Okay, Chris, for the first.
So I'll take 3 questions.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for your questions. They covered a range of different areas, so I'm going to give a very sort of brief response to each. So in the order in which the questions were asked, so you were asking what can the government do to reduce inequality, like what should they prioritise? And I guess I want to be careful, okay, as a researcher, to be clear what my research can say and what it can't say. So my research showed what people think the government should do, which is not necessarily right. You know, like, so people were saying, say, like, taxing the rich was a low priority, but actually a very easy way to reduce inequality is by increasing taxes on the rich. Might not help people, right, but you know, by lowering the top end of the distribution, that does have an effect. I'm not advocating that that is necessarily what the government should be prioritising, right? I'm just showing you that, you know, what people want might not necessarily be always the best way to do things. Yep. So I'm only showing you what people want, not necessarily what the government should do. Yep. So then on the point of ideology that you mentioned, you might have to clarify if I missed the sort of point there, but I guess in terms of ideology, obviously people have different ideology when they respond, like to this survey, and their sort of views about what is kind of what the role is of the government and what the role is of individual effort. Right. But I guess the focus which I've tried to look at here is not just what people sort of think in general, but how can their minds change when they're given with information. And because of the randomized control trial design, it means that we're able to sort of ensure that people's ideology is the same across each of the groups. So therefore, the effective information is actually captured accurately by the randomized control trial because you have the same type of people on average in each group. Right? So ideology is maybe explaining the general results but not the effective information, because that's kind of controlled for in the randomized control trial. Your point around infrastructure and why is the government prioritising infrastructure if that's not what people necessarily want? Well, it could be the case, right? It could be that infrastructure would actually be good to reduce inequality. So therefore, the government shouldn't necessarily always do what people want, I guess, you know, like if it is that they have good reason to believe and good evidence to illustrate that, you know, building infrastructure, particularly in eastern Indonesia, could actually go a long way to sort of balancing their wealth across the country. So I guess that's kind of something to think about, which is that the government has an important role to represent what people want, right? But also the government has an important role to look at all the evidence and try and make a good decision based upon all the evidence, which is not what the general public has the time to do. So as a result, there's a balancing there between doing what people want, but also to do what people have that general desire to reduce inequality.
Sorry, can I respond a bit? Just
okay.
For the infrastructure. I'm raising this question because it is interesting when some people say that about the increasing of the how do you call it, loan from the foreign institution, blah blah blah. I think it's it means that I don't know whether the government don't do enough to explaining their policy, for example, in their building infrastructure, because it seems like people doesn't understand that when you build infrastructure that should been done like many years ago, of course you will have a more for loan from maybe from the country, other foreign countries, or maybe from World Bank or whatsoever. Well, it is also probably because of the politics motives, but do you think this is the lack of the communication from the government to communicating this? Because it's from the data that you show, it's so very low, I see, right?
Yeah.
Which is, I think when you create building infrastructure, you can create jobs more, and then you can provide more social protection spread out all over the country. So I think it should be like the first or the second at least.
Yeah, well, so I hear what you're saying, but the people responded back not putting infrastructure very highly. But maybe that's because of the fact that there could be more communication around the benefits, right, of infrastructure by politicians and by the government. So maybe that's the case. And just finally on the financial literacy point, so more research is required in that area. So I can't really comment with too much sort of detail. In terms of your question about creating jobs and how to create jobs and what people want in terms of creating jobs, there's many things that the government can do to create jobs. They can hire more people directly, or they can support the private sector to hire more people, or they can try and invest in labour-intensive sectors to try and encourage more kind of opportunities for people. But this survey doesn't kind of go to that depth. And one of the reasons is because of the fact that people may not be aware of all the different types of policy options that the Indonesian government could actually use to create jobs. So we want to talk about creating jobs in a general sense, not the specifics, just because there are some people who completed our survey who haven't even finished primary school and are in remote parts of Indonesia, and it may be hard for them to understand. Well, that's not, I shouldn't say that. So it may be more challenging to kind of appreciate the menu, because the government actually has quite a long list of potential options that they could pursue. On your point on international relations, I actually don't think that international, like the situation in the US or if Russia or if China or something affects Indonesian inequality a large amount directly. Maybe there's a lot of indirect sort of aspects to it, but in terms of directly, maybe the most direct way is, say, the fact that Singapore can operate as maybe a tax haven, you know, like for people in Indonesia, that is maybe an example whereby this international relations is directly affecting inequality, but most of this other sort of international relations, it's indirect at best.
Okay, so the second opportunity for...
No, may I edit some
okay.
more like related still? But if we're talking about redistribution and how far the inequality, and like you said before, maybe related to or as Firdaus asked before, like you said that indirectly, we're talking about tax, right? We could also talking about tax. Some of the taxes for the rich people, it came from the imported things. Yes, what I'm trying to say, like, if we're specify or focus on the imported goods or stuff that in a international studies perspective, if there's a policy between the countries that makes some goods like the Japan so far been doing, like using their dumping economy policy, like making their goods as cheap as possible. So even no matter how high the tax for the imported luxury goods from Japan, it won't matter much regardless of the inflation, etc., etc. So maybe what you're saying indirect, that's also indirect. Or if it's related directly to tax, it could be direct, or I still confuse between the indirect or direct category.
Yep, okay, cool. So yeah, so the inequality sort of situation and the support for redistribution we're talking about here is almost entirely domestic policy, and the type of taxes that people pay at the border, so for tariffs, right, on imports and taxes on imports, they don't make up like a too large a share, right, of the actual kind of tax revenue for the government. But more importantly than that, it's actually a burden that everyone has to face to some extent. Yes, I agree that luxury goods, obviously only the rich pay those taxes, but when there are tariffs on a range of essential items, right, that increases the price in Indonesia for everyone to have to pay. So the poorest people are worse off. Okay, so that's like, but that doesn't kind of necessarily affect kind of inequality too much within the country. This is more the kind of, I consider to be not a key, probably not a key policy issue to address inequality. However, there are, it maybe affects things a little bit, but not very much.
Okay. Yeah. Satu, dua. Any question? Okay, let's.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. So I kind of have like 3 questions. The first is you did all the survey through online, right? And with online survey, it's notoriously difficult to ensure the response rate. So I wonder about the response rate. What is your trick to get the response rate that you want? And the second one is, I'm not sure whether this can be captured with your data, but I wonder whether you can see some sort of like unintended consequences from giving this information, because there's a saying that ignorance is bliss, right? So basically what you did here is like bursting the bubble of their perception of where they are in terms of like the income distribution. And lastly, I think it's very interesting the result that you have about creating jobs and the social protection. I wonder whether you can get this from the data, trying to interact in your estimation, trying to interact with the people have access to the social protection that the government have provided. Because I assume that if they do have access, then the concept of social protection becomes more real. For some people who didn't really have access to that, it's some sort of like an abstract concept, right? They wouldn't know like what kind of social protection will benefit them. But I think just with that, if you have data with that, I think you can get a sense of like how like access to social protection influence the perception of social protection, because it may be like you say in your summary, that it may be just because the social protection, they don't see it as benefiting them directly.
Namanya siapa?
Oh, Milda.
Dari?
UI.
Thank you. I'm very basic in the issue of inequality actually, but I'll ask you a question. Can I conclude that one of contribution of the Indonesian perception of inequality, which shapes their support for redistribution, is the failure of financing universal coverage or social solidarity of social protection, such as the BPJS? You know the BPJS? Yeah. Does it contribute to the failure of social protection financing? That's my question, because you also capture some countries such as Australia, Denmark, and some Scandinavian countries which are familiar with the mechanism of the higher income, the higher tax. So the second question is also about is it possible to enable the system of higher income and higher tax in Indonesia with the current perception of inequality which shapes the Indonesian support for redistribution? Thank you.
One question again? Any? Okay.
Sorry, I have more than one question. So
Okay. One A, B, C.
Yeah. So thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting indeed. The question is about it's interesting of the last finding basically. Wondering, is there a comparison study, because you've done this in other countries as well, do you actually compare the result with other countries which may have longer period for social protections being introduced on? Because considering in Indonesia, social protection is rather new to be introduced to the general public, right? Usually it's very targeted for specific population. And then the second question is, from the beginning, the particular findings is already setting up some baseline information. Yeah, one is they see the growth of their own is through their own effort. So that's already a baseline finding. And the second one is they also see the perceptions of redistribution needs is already actually high. So with that kind of baseline, it's kind of expected, right? That their perceptions will not change when they get more information, because it's already a self-perception that everything should move from their own effort. So jobs is what they hope, because that's what they can count on themselves. But is there actually an expectation for an increase, hope for social protections there? Is that a theory you want to prove? And the third one is, what's actually the behavioral change you hope to achieve from this study? Are you actually targeting this for the government to, because I'm concerned because of this result, the government then see, oh, doing social protections and infrastructures and such are actually not popular for my people. So maybe we shouldn't focus on that. That's a concern, right? That's bursting a bubble, not just for the people who then realize, oh, I am actually poor or I'm actually not poor, but also a bubble for the government. Apparently what they do are not actually popular, or maybe it's not just yet popular, but in this kind of situation where people's perception does matter, I'm worried on what's the expectation of behavioral change here. And also, do you actually also targeting the people to have more dependent on social protections or government? You want them to have more push. What's actually the expectations here? Because then it relates on how you want to use this research.
Yeah. So the second question from TV artikel 3, the third is from Ibu Pinkan from Case.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you for those really fantastic questions. Really, really great questions. So I presented this a number of times this week, and they're among the best questions I've got all week. So yeah, really, really good questions. So I'll go through one by one again. So in terms of the online survey, so the way how people complete the online survey is that YouGov, right, the survey firm, enters a partnership with the mobile phone companies, and they contact large random samples of their customers to invite them to join the YouGov survey sort of instrument, right? People who have online access on their mobile phones to join them. So they capture a large number of internet users. And when people complete surveys, they get a small amount of phone credit, right? So they have an incentive to complete the survey because they get a small amount of phone credit, and not many people drop out in the survey because they are thinking, I'm going to get my phone credit at the end. So that's kind of how that works. In terms of unintended consequences, I mean, it's beyond my ability to capture the effect of the unintended consequences at this point in time. Yeah. And then, yeah, you're talking about whether people had access to social protection themselves or didn't have access. We can't disentangle that in this survey. In the 2014 survey that was done, they did try and capture that, and there didn't tend to be huge differences in the results among people. Sorry, huge differences in the results whether they personally had social protection or not. Yep. So Yeah, I guess the point that you were raising was about the sort of social solidarity, you know, and whether Indonesia, my results show that Indonesia could head to a situation of higher taxes and higher transfers. But I actually do think that that is quite sort of possible given the results of the study. Like, people genuinely seem like they are supportive of redistribution, right? They want the government to be doing more to address inequality. So that's a key takeaway from what I'm showing, which is that people may be willing to tolerate a little bit more tax, right, if it's going to lead to greater redistribution to address inequality. But what my research shows is the way how to achieve that is not by going out there and telling everyone about inequality, right? Because if you go out there and say to everyone, oh, inequality is so bad, can't believe how unequal Indonesia is, that's not leading them to want to pay higher taxes or be supportive of social protection. Right? So that's like the sort of key distinction there. To motivate a more social solidarity, there needs to be things other than telling people just about inequality. And so this kind of relates to some of the points that you're raising as well, but we presented this at the President's office and they were very interested in the results. And their sort of approach is for the President to go out there and tell everyone how inequality needs to be addressed. There's very high levels of inequality in Indonesia, and we are going to address it by increasing social protection. But when you go out there and tell everyone about the level of inequality, they want you to create jobs, right? Not social protection. So that's how people respond to that information. So they were like, okay, we need to change the way we communicate our narrative for how we want sort of Indonesia to transition to this sort of higher taxes, higher transfers sort of society. So I guess I should touch on your point in regards to the international comparison. One of the striking findings in our study was that in 5 of the 6 middle-income countries, information about inequality did not lead to greater support for social protection. Information about inequality reduced support for social protection in 5 out of 6 of the countries. So in Mexico, in Nigeria, in South Africa, and in India, in addition to Indonesia, when we provided people with information about inequality, that lowered their support for social protection. So there seems to be a general trend, not just in Indonesia. Yeah, I guess like you spoke about like the theory or behavioural change that we're hoping to see, or what we kind of wanted. Well, our expectation, based upon economic theory, was that when we corrected these misperceptions that we spoke about at the start, once we let people know about the overall level of inequality, or once we let people know about their place in the income distribution, our expectation was that this would lead to greater support for redistribution. That's what our expectation was, correcting these misperceptions, because that's like what the economic theory was predicting. So we were quite, surprised that that wasn't the effect. But you know that we are being honest with our results, right? Because we were surprised as well with what we found. We also registered this in advance with the American Economic Association, like Randomized Control Trial registry, whereby you let them know in advance what you're doing. So then once you do it, you can't change your mind. You know, like you have to let them know in advance what you're doing. Then you go do it, and then you can't lie, so or make up or play with the data to get the result that you want. So whether we like the result that we have or not, we are stuck with it. So this is what the reality is of what we find. Am I concerned about how the government will respond? Well, while I would like to think that the research that we do leads to big policy implications, I think it's also important to be kind of probably somewhat humble and realise that the government will probably do whatever it wants to do, regardless of our research, in terms of the general picture in regards to rolling out social protection. And I think that that's this transition to social solidarity, whereby we have higher taxes and higher transfers occurring, is, I think, the direction that the government is heading. What I do think our research does have a positive effect for policymakers is it makes it clearer to them how to get there. And if that's the path you want to go on, you shouldn't be out there talking to everyone about how high the level of inequality is and justify increased social protection expenditure based upon inequality, because that's not seen to be an effect. So as long as policymakers use the results for what it's meant to be there for, which is to understand what people want and how information affects how people want, I'm not too concerned. I'll stop there.
Okay. We still have 8 minutes. Okay.
Just want to make sure. Previously, we were discussing about Japan, but it's between South Korean and USA now. They are doing some international relation related to the economy, because either I think Samsung's already, but Apple itself going to be their development or research or local fabrication here in Indonesia, because Apple already also considered that Indonesia one of its biggest market. But then what happened with the pricing of Apple, of course, also added by the inflation caused by the dollars. The perception of inequality when the Apple didn't come yet locally produced in Indonesia, it's still perceived as luxury by our people, by Indonesian people. But there's a chance that some goods going to be as perceived as the people's stuff. Like that's why in the US, Apple is very, very common to be used or common to be seized almost everywhere. What will happen if it's going to be, and they make their fabrication here, and then it makes the price of technology going down, and it's not about tax only, but if we are talking about redistribution, the possibility that the factory will come also with the education center. They will also trying to strategically offering such tax deduction programs, which is still unknown. Whereas as Indonesian, one of Indonesian people, we do really want that kind of tax deductible kind of ways, not only for the rich, because sometimes even the middle economy and social lifestyle or level, they do have a luxury kind of living or price. And yeah, what's your, maybe either it's related or not, but what's your opinion related to the inequality and redistribution if it's going to be happen in the near future?
Do you want to ask?
Okay, quickly.
Yes. I think to continue Tovan question, this is a bit futuristic, but maybe developed country like in Australia, for example, maybe you already prepared, and we already facing this, especially developing country, is how far the inequality will grow more as a result of trade war, and as well as the digital economy itself, because beside innovation and the digital economy has given more people the share to develop, but that's also another shadow is also increasing people to, for example, even individuals need to compete, for example, with not human, like for example with robots, yeah, or something. So maybe this is more like futuristic rather than based on research, blah blah blah. Thank you.
Ya, oke, bahas aja ya.
Last question.
Ya, berkaitan dengan metode sih sebenarnya karena tertarik dengan ya saya kalau eksperimen itu biasanya kita pengen menguji sesuatu hipotesis atau tesis, kita lakukan eksperimen dengan kontrol. Kemudian dengan SCT ini kan survei, eksperimen survei mungkin ya. Oke. Yang pengen saya tanya, ketika diambil sampel 3.700 itu, apakah menentukan apakah itu berdasarkan populasi aja atau memperhitungkan sebaran geografis? Nah, biasa kalau survei ada pemetikkan sebaran geografis. Lalu yang kedua, untuk mengeliminir apakah yang di dalam, apakah ada cara tertentu untuk mengeliminir sampel yang punya prior knowledge tentang inequality atau tidak, itu bagaimana mensortir itu. Lalu kemudian ya saya kira itu saja.
Jadi tentang stratifikasi nih Pak ya. Jadi apa yang di consider untuk distratifikasikan, apakah geografik area atau yang lain?
Biasanya ada satu SCTI, dia modelnya itu komunitas. Jadi komunitas A, komunitas B, kemudian dikasih treatment berbeda. Tapi ini kan melalui survei. Nah, seringkali survei itu kita ketika dibilang 3.700 itu adalah sampel untuk Indonesia, itu memperhitungkan sebaran seluruh Indonesia. Maksudnya, apakah itu bisa digeneralisir? Maksud saya seperti itu.
So the sampling is representative to Indonesia people or representative to what population? I think it's about sampling.
Okay, yep, so the survey is representative of the Indonesian population with access to the internet, right? Which is the majority of Indonesians, but not everyone. So there is over 140 million Facebook accounts in Indonesia. You know, like a lot of people have access to the internet in Indonesia, but not every single person. So yeah, so some people in remote parts of Indonesia or who are very poor, we can't capture them. Just to wrap up in the last minute on these points that you guys are raising. So I understand that a lot of airtime, you know, a lot of talk in the media is around things like the trade wars or about the tax arrangements with international companies, and about automation and things like this. And while I can see that they all have a role to play and are all important to some extent, I don't think that they are a key issue.